All right, now let's talk about the diffuse modulatory systems. Now we're talking about systems in the brain where you have neurons that start from one location or a small set of nuclei that communicate with a large number of neurons that may be spread over a wide area of the brain and often don't form individual synapses. Instead, they simply release their neurotransmitter into the extracellular fluid and it just diffuses to other neurons that happen to be nearby. So there are basically four sets of systems that we call the diffuse modulatory systems, and they each are characterized by a different neurotransmitter. So the four neurotransmitters that are classified in this way are use dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine. So what all of these systems have in common is that, and they have a lot different about them too. It's just that they all have some characteristics that they have in common. So that's why we group them together. But for one, they all start from a small core set of neurons somewhere in the brain, usually in either the brainstem or the midbrain. And then their cell bodies, like I said, are usually not in the cortex. So in other words, they might be in the brainstem, they might be in the midbrain. There's even some in the diencephalon, but for the most part, these are not cortical neurons. And like I said, their neurotransmitter is released in kind of a diffuse way. So rather than simply being released at an individual synapse, an individual synaptic cleft, their neurotransmitter gets released into a broader area, and it may have an effect on a large number of downstream neurons. And their influence can be widespread throughout, sometimes throughout the entire brain, depending on the system you're talking about. So first of all, the noradrenergic system, or norepinephrine system, it consists of, starts with anyway, neurons in this part of the brainstem called the locus coeruleus. And so locus coeruleus is down here, and it has neurons in it that use norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. Again, noradrenaline is another name for norepinephrine, so sometimes this is called the noradrenergic system, and we call this region the noradrenergic locus coeruleus. But the word locus coeruleus means, the word locus just means location or spot, and coeruleus actually means blue. So literally, it's the blue spot. It's called that just because in certain preparations, if you look at it in cross section, it has a grayish bluish tint to it. But again, the neurons themselves sit kind of right here in the border line between the pons and the midbrain, and the axons that come out of these neurons go to pretty much the entire central nervous system. So there are axons that go to the spinal cord, the cerebellum, and to the thalamus, the hypothalamus, pretty much every part of the cerebral cortex. So it has very widespread effect. The function, the way we can figure out kind of what the role of these systems is to look at what happens or what causes them to become activated. So in animal studies, what we do is you stick an electrode into this part of the brain, and then you just kind of wait and see what triggers them. When do they become active? When are they inactive? And so in the case of the locus coeruleus, these neurons are activated anytime the animal is exposed to some sort of new, usually unexpected stimulus, usually non-painful sensory stimulus. And that then triggers those neurons to become active, presumably releasing norepinephrine all over the brain. And we can also learn what these neurons do by damaging them. So whenever we say that a nucleus or any part of the brain is involved in something, what that means is if that system is damaged or non-functional, then it influences or affects one or more functions. So for example, in the case of the the locus coeruleus, because it's activated by novel, unexpected stimuli. It seems to have a role in attention, meaning the ability of the brain to focus on one particular sensory stimulus over another. Arousal, meaning basically just your general awakeness or alertness, and to that end, it's also involved in the sleep-wake cycle. Generally, these neurons are active when you're awake and not so much when you're asleep. They also seem to have a role in learning and memory, in modulating pain. They're related to mood, and even brain metabolism. Now, it may sound like that's a long list of things for one neurotransmitter to do, but the word involved in is important there, because basically for something to be involved in one or more functions, it just means that they have some sort of direct or indirect effect. So that doesn't necessarily mean that these neurons are necessary and sufficient for all those different functions. It just means that they have some sort of role, and that's actually pretty characteristic of all the diffuse modulatory systems, because their outputs go to lots of different parts of the brain. They can have some sort of function in lots of different functions, lots of different mental functions. Meanwhile, the serotonin in the brain primarily comes from what are called the raphe nuclei. Raphe means ridge, and so it has to do with where these neurons are located, close to the midline of the brain. And these neurons are located in several regions throughout the pons and the medulla. And again, they release serotonin as a neurotransmitter, and their axons, like the locus coeruleus neurons, go kind of all over the place. So cortex, thalamus, hypothalamus, cerebellum, spinal cord, pretty much everything, everywhere they can go, they do. Again, they're similar to locus coeruleus neurons in that they're more active when you're awake than when you're asleep. These neurons, and to some extent the locus coeruleus neurons too, form part of what's called the ascending reticular activating system. And so these neurons all together are important for, again, just sort of generally keeping the brain online, sort of maintaining a baseline level of activity, especially during the waking part of the day, or when the brain's awake. And so for that reason, as you might guess, the serotonin system is also important for the sleep-wake cycle, and important for mood. In fact, a lot of mood disorders, things like depression, bipolar disorder, manic depressive, and so on, are the serotonin system is implicated in, so or can be treated by influencing the serotonin system. So that's what we mean. In fact, when we say, serotonin is involved in mood, we know that if you raise serotonin, you can improve some mood disorders and vice versa. Dopamine in the brain primarily comes from two regions, one of which we've already talked about. So the nigrostriatal dopamine system originates in a region in the midbrain called the substantia nigra, specifically a thin layer of cells called the pars compacta. And of course, we've already talked about substantia nigra in the context of the motor systems, because the substantia nigra is part of the basal nuclei system. So the axons from the substantia nigra that carry dopamine go to the striatum. That's why it's called the nigrostriatal system. And specifically the caudate putamen, that's more like the dorsal part of the striatum. And its job is in regulating movement. So remember that the main job of the basal nuclei is to help facilitate voluntary movements, help inhibit unwanted movements. And so and we know that when the nigrostriatal dopamine system is disrupted, you get the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So you have decreased movement, rigidity, resting tremor, and so on. So that is the main role of that system. Meanwhile, there's a separate area that's actually just next to the substantia nigra called the ventral tegmental area. This is, as the name implies, it's in the ventral side of the midbrain. Remember, the tegmentum is the floor of the midbrain. And so the dopamine neurons here have axons that go to various regions, including the frontal cortex, in an area called the nucleus accumbens. which is, at least in rodents, is basically the ventral most part of the striatum. However, and so the mesolimbic, this is called the mesolimbic pathway because, again, it starts in the midbrain, meso meaning middle, or coming from the mesencephalon. And then limbic is referring to the limbic system, which is kind of this diffuse structure that includes things like the nucleus accumbens. But in any case, the job of the mesolimbic dopamine system is different from the nigrostriatal system. It does have some role movement, but really its main job seems to be involving the reward and reinforcement networks in the brain. So basically, any rewarding stimulus, and by rewarding we mean anything that an animal experiences, and then it goes out of its way to encounter that stimulus again, we usually consider rewarding. So usually means anything that's beneficial. So food, water, sex, for example, are all considered rewarding stimuli. And so, for example, when an animal is hungry and encounters food, that usually triggers the reward system, and then it's considering reinforcing, because if any behavior was necessary to acquire the food, so in a lab setting, that would be like pressing a lever, for example, or if any other stimulus was associated with the reward. So, for example, if you let's say ring a bell every time you provide the food, then eventually what will happen is the bell itself will become rewarding, meaning that it will actually trigger the dopamine neurons to fire from the ventral tegmental area. And in fact, this is an important mechanism for learning and memory, because especially implicit memory. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about memory at some point later, but the system is really important for that. Of course, there are other things that can trigger the mesolimbic dopamine system, various drugs. In fact, pretty much all addictive drugs work by activating the dopamine system. Any addictive behavior at all, in fact, will usually works by overactivating the system. So it's important for that, those kinds of things also. And then finally, we have the cholinergic system. So these are neurons in the brain that use acetylcholine. Now, we've talked about acetylcholine before because it is important in the peripheral nervous system, both the somatic motor system and the autonomic nervous system neurons use acetylcholine, but there are acetylcholine neurons in the brain that just communicate within the brain, and they are another example of these diffuse modulatory systems. And these neurons, again, are kind of distributed through several areas. So, for example, there's sort of two populations. There's one group that originates in the basal forebrain. So this is not really part of the brain stem. It's actually part of the telencephalon. But these structures down here, they have different names, like the medial septal nuclei. The septum is actually a structure that divides the lateral ventricles down the middle, and then this structure called the basal nucleus of Meynert. Those are both part of the basal forebrain. Their axons go out into the cerebral cortex for the most part. They're also, again, involved in sort of arousal, sleep-wake cycle, also involved in learning and memory. These neurons, it's worth pointing out, are some of the first ones to die in Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's eventually is a neurodegenerative disease that affects the entire brain, but these acetylcholine neurons are some of the most sensitive to whatever it is that triggers the degeneration of Alzheimer's. And in fact, treatment with acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, meaning drugs that prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine, are one way to treat kind of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's. Then there's a separate system of acetylcholine neurons in the brainstem, and it's this complex neuron. It's not really a tightly grouped nucleus, so it has the lovely name of the pontomesencephalotegmental complex, which basically means the neurons are kind of spread all over. Some of them are in the pons, some of them are in the tegmentum, but they are all in that same region. Their axons don't actually go very far. They kind of stay. They go to the thalamus and to the hypothalamus and other parts of the brainstem, and their role is kind of harder to pin down. They seem to have some role in regulating sensory input that probably relates to their projection to the thalamus, but other than that, it's not entirely clear what their function is. Now, another thing that these diffuse modulatory systems have in common is that they are they have a lot of influence, or they're easily influenced by various drugs, because their neurons kind of are spread all over the place and target a wide area. Drugs that interact with these neurotransmitters or their receptors can have diffuse and widespread effects. So, for example, LSD is a drug. This is the structure over here, that acts as a hallucinogen, and it works by binding, in part by binding to the receptor for serotonin. So this is the structure of serotonin, and presumably LSD binds to or resembles serotonin enough that it binds to the same receptor, and it triggers hallucination. So hallucination means some sort of sensory experience that does not correspond to an actual sensory stimulus. So that might mean seeing things that aren't there, or people that aren't there, hearing voices that aren't real. Some people who experience who take LSD report kind of a dreamlike state. It's worth remembering that serotonin, like some of these other neurotransmitters, is involved in the sleep-wake cycle. So in fact, one possible mechanism for LSD is it essentially triggers a network in the brain that would be active if you were dreaming, and so that's one that's been one explanation for the mechanism of LSD. It's essentially like having a dream while you're still awake, and it might be because the drug binds to the same receptor that's involved in the sleep-wake cycle. And then there are a lot of drugs that work through the dopamine system. I already said that dopamine is one of the reward systems in the brain. And it's also important to point out that chemically these systems have a lot in common. So we talked about the synthesis of dopamine and norepinephrine before. So remember that norepinephrine is actually synthesized from dopamine. So dopamine neurons make dopamine from L-dopa, which is in turn made from tyrosine. And norepinephrine neurons also make dopamine the same way, but then they turn it into norepinephrine. So chemically, those two have a lot in common. So in fact, drugs that interact with the dopamine system also sometimes interact with the norepinephrine system. And so there's in fact a lot of drugs that work by either activating receptors for dopamine and norepinephrine, or by working through reuptake transporters. So cocaine, for example, and amphetamine both are stimulants that work by blocking the reuptake of both norepinephrine and dopamine. So remember, norepinephrine, again, its job has to do with arousal and alertness, and so by blocking norepinephrine reuptake, you are essentially increasing the amount of norepinephrine in the synapse, which means that those neurons that respond to norepinephrine become more active. So again, it kind of increases the activity of those circuits. Dopamine, meanwhile, like we said, is involved in the reward system. So cocaine works by blocking the reuptake of dopamine, increasing the amount of dopamine in the synapse, which in turn just increases the response to the dopamine response to any given rewarding stimulus. So anything that creates a reward will, you'll have a rewarding response even in the absence of the stimulus. And so cocaine itself becomes, and other drugs that increase the amount of dopamine released from either releasing dopamine or increase in the binding of dopamine to their receptors, will again become rewarding and eventually lead to addiction. So pretty much all addictive drugs work either directly or indirectly through the dopamine system. In the case of cocaine and amphetamine, it directly activates or directly increases dopamine levels, whereas other addictive drugs, like say nicotine, don't directly activate dopamine receptors, but they do lead to the increased release of dopamine indirectly, and that's how it becomes addictive. All right, so that does it for chapter 15. So thanks for listening.